5. And we are live, and welcome to another Pilot Institute live session. I'm excited this week because we have quite a bit of news actually. This happened last week on Friday. The RDQ Race Day Quad lawsuit, the final ruling came out from the Court of Appeal. And this was kind of a big document, and we kind of digested it over the weekend. I know a lot of other people have been posting information about this, but I wanted to bring in some experts to talk about this. Some people have been close to remote ID and that actually know what they're talking about because they're both attorneys. The first person is Kenji Sugahara. You've seen Kenji on our show before. He's the CEO of the Drone Service Provider Alliance, and we've talked to him at length about remote ID and a bunch of other things in the past. And then also Scott Shtofman, who's the I'm going to have to read your title because it's I don't know how it fits on your business card. He's the manager of Grassroots, Advocacy, and Chapter Engagement at AUVSI. So thanks both of you for being on the show live today.
Absolutely. Great to be on.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
So a little bit of background about this lawsuit. Race Day Quad, RDQ, and then also Tyler Brennan, who's the owner of RDQ, came up with a lawsuit in March of 2021 with the FAA about remote ID. This was in front of the U.S. Court of Appeal. Now, when you sue the government and an agency like the FAA, you kind of skip one of these steps and you get straight to the Court of Appeal in D.C. And then they had written arguments that were submitted in August of 2021. The FAA replied back in October of 2021. And then some of you may have seen the oral arguments that happened in December of 2021. There was kind of a lot of talk at that time. And then it's been radio silence since the end of July 29th, which was last Friday, when the Court of Appeal released their final final ruling, I guess, in favor of the FAA. So what we're going to talk about today is kind of what was in the lawsuit. I know a lot of you have been asking questions, and we want to go kind of in detail talking about the lawsuit in itself and what that lawsuit was all about, and also what the response from the court was, because to me, that's where the interesting nuggets were located, is what kind of implication this is going to have. So I'll let our guest talk in a minute, but I wanted to kind of highlight the 5 things that were in that complaint from Tyler Brennan. And we're going to say Brennan instead of saying RDQ because that's the way that it's actually highlighted in the document. But the first one was that remote ID infringed on the drone's operator expectation of privacy. This was a Fourth Amendment case that they brought up. The number 2 was that the FAA relied on some secret meetings that had happened during the rulemaking process. We'll talk about that briefly. The number 3 was that the final rule for remote ID was not a logical extension or outgrowth of what the proposed rule was with the FAA when they originally proposed it. And then the FAA, they also claimed that the FAA did not consult with certain entities out there. We'll talk about which ones in a minute. And then the last one, which I thought was, there was a couple interesting points in there, was that the FAA failed to address some of the material comments that actually were in the notice of proposed rulemaking from the general community. So without further ado, let's talk about the first one. Let's get started with that first one, which is that remote ID essentially equates to what Tyler Brennan said, warrantless governmental surveillance in violation of the Fourth Amendment. And maybe I'll get started with you, Kenji, if you can give us a little bit of background about this and what the reasoning was behind this position.
So, Greg, can I start out with something a little bit different? One of the most interesting things about this entire process was the oral arguments, and we all know from the oral arguments it went absolutely horribly. So there was a lot of people in the industry who were really concerned about what was going to happen, because if there was a negative sort of ruling against the FAA, we'd be back into square one. There'd be a lot of issues. So the bright side was the court took so long to make a ruling. We had a feeling that something like this, they might be doing a lot of research and thinking through all the issues and going step by step by step. And just as in general, just taking a look at the ruling itself, you can see that they put in a lot of effort. So I just wanted to put that out there as an observation. One of the things that you brought up, of course, is the Fourth Amendment issue, which is the search and seizure issue. And the way the court wrote it is to prevail that Brennan must establish that no set of circumstances exist under which the rule would be valid. And the piece that was interesting is Brennan said, you know what, out in the open air, remote ID makes sense. So in essence, by putting that forward, he undercut his argument to sort of take the rule out, so to speak. So the court took that ruling, made that ruling, and said there isn't really a Fourth Amendment issue, especially in the open air, because on page 16 it says it's hard to see what could be private about flying a drone in the open air. They also go on to say, for example, there's no issue flying indoors because remote ID isn't required to be on indoors as well. So they took care of that issue because Brennan argued that if there would be a search and seizure if you were flying inside and there was a requirement for remote ID.
Did you want to add anything to that, Scott?
Yeah. And I deal with a lot of state and local rules. So kind of where does that intersection happen between federal and state and local legislation? And from our perspective at AUVSI and with our members, it's really important that we have something from the court saying there is a pretty clear division there, that this is the dominion of the FAA to be handling this kind of thing, where you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy when you're out there flying your drone for people to be able to see. And sort of where is the delineation between where you think you should have privacy and not, and if you're flying below the treetops and things like that, or near your house or something like that, is that a place where you would expect to have privacy? And the court essentially said that's not. It's not important, and also it doesn't. You haven't shown that there's a harm there. You haven't shown that you should reasonably have an expectation of privacy there when you're sitting inside your house operating the drone versus where the drone is itself. Kind of, is there a connection between the location of the drone versus the location of the control station? Because both of those things are linked with standard remote ID versus if you're using a dongle or something like that, where it's a retrofit and you're just broadcasting the takeoff location. So we can get a little bit more into some of the technical differences between the two going forward. But I think that they came at it from the right direction, that really trying to challenge the remote ID rule on its face from a Fourth Amendment perspective, really, there just wasn't a leg to stand on.
And what I find interesting... Go ahead, Kenji.
So Greg, the other thing too is that they distinguished Carpenter, which was the GPS monitoring of cell phones. And they distinguished it from the persistent, pervasive sort of tracking that you could do with a cell phone. And when they looked at drones, they said it's relatively short-term monitoring of persons' movements in public spaces, which is okay. And they also took a look at the average length of flight that most hobbyists did, and it was very short, and it wasn't very often at all. So it wasn't the sort of intrusive tracking that was a concern. There was also a piece about network remote ID where there was a potential of persistent pervasive tracking there. So they did make that note that there could be some challenges made in the future, especially if there was an invasion of somebody's reasonable expectation of privacy. But what was interesting was it's going to be done on a case-by-case basis rather than the invalidation of the rule.
Well, let's talk about that, actually. That's a little further down my discussion list, but you mentioned the network remote ID thing, and the FAA did, not the FAA, I'm sorry, the court did mention that the FAA nixed the network remote ID from the final ruling, and it almost sounds like the reason they did it was because of some of these privacy issues. Do you think that means the death of remote ID as a network solution in the future, or do you think it's going to be looked completely differently in the future?
So from my perspective, I think it depends. If there's a mandatory requirement for network remote ID, then yeah, there is an issue. But if it's an option that users could choose, then I think it becomes a little bit different issue, which would allow for it. But I think mandatory, especially when you have all this data going into a number of databases or centralized database, there could be issues as well. There's also the system of records notices that they mentioned as well. And they said any provision of that information to law enforcement would require an update to a SORN or new regulations. And for those out there who don't understand what a system of records notice is, a system of records notices are required when all the following apply. Records are maintained by a federal agency. The records contain information about an individual, and the records are retrieved by a personal identifier. In this case, it would be the remote ID sort of message with the identifier, and you could tie it with the personally identifiable information of the remote pilot. So that would require a new SORN by the FAA, and that's where there's a new process involved with that as well. There are some certain limitations in terms of when records may be released, and that can be found in 5 USC 552A. And the conditions of disclosure: no agency shall disclose any record which is contained in a system of records by any means of communication to any person or to another agency except pursuant to a written request. And those written requests really have to be made by under certain circumstances or by certain entities. For example, if there's a court order, or it's for other agencies under specific circumstances. So there's a certain number of requirements, and you can find that under 552A.
And somebody's asking in the chat, what exactly is network remote ID? Scott, do you maybe want to take a jab at that and explain what that means?
Sure.
And how it would work?
Sure. So in the original proposed rule for remote ID, there were essentially two types. There's a broadcast or a network. So essentially what it means is that your drone itself and or the control station, part of that whole system, would be connected to the internet while you're operating. So the location would be able to be sent and then pushed out, aggregated across the internet via either a cellular signal or some other form of radio. So think about it as like a broadband connection or your cell phone where you've got access to the internet and it's always working. Your location could be picked up and then pushed around so other people will be able to see it, versus the broadcast version that we came to in the final rule is that it's only essentially within the radio transmission distance of whichever version you choose, whether that's Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or something along those lines. So essentially you've got radio line of sight within a mile or at most maybe a few miles when you don't have really congested airwaves. And so what it means is that with network, you would have been able to essentially probably have more people to be able to see that information. You would have had websites or other people essentially aggregating and then pulling information from that, saying, all right, we have a bunch of operators within this area, or, essentially building off of those pieces. Versus broadcast, you have to be physically standing near the drone or the control station to pick up that signal. And so I think part of that, there were privacy concerns that we talked about for a second, and then also potentially some technological concerns on how easy would it be to integrate that kind of a system into current drones or new drones where swap, size, weight, and power is such a huge issue, right? Everything that we're adding physically onto the drone takes away from either performance or ability to stay in the air. So those are some of the considerations that came in around the difference between network and broadcast.
Yep. And
Scott, don't forget one important piece too, and that was the cost, because you're not only talking the cellular modem involved, but we're also looking at the monthly cost. For example, from cellular carriers, that we'd expect some sort of monthly cost, and that was one of the big issues as well.
That was definitely something that we mentioned in our response to the NPRM. To me, the airspace access needs to remain free. We've seen what paying for the airspace access has done in Europe, and we don't want to go that route. And having to pay just a subscription, to me, is not free access to the airspace. So we need to keep fighting for that. Now, I want to go back, Kenji, to what you mentioned, because there was a quote in here on page 23, and I'm going to read it, and we're going to put it on the screen as well. It says, "Any use of remote ID data, including by law enforcement personnel, is bound by all constitutional restrictions and any other applicable legal restrictions. And you kind of started talking about this, but to me, it sounds like it's going to be going through quite a few hoops by local law enforcement to be able to even get the name of the person that is flying the drone up there. And to me, it almost sounds like this is not what we were sold as a solution for remote ID. We were told that this was going to help people identify the bad actors that are out there, but not if only the FAA has access to that data. And law enforcement has to go through paperwork in order to get it. They won't be able to do that on the field live. Can you comment on this? Am I wrong? Am I looking at this the wrong way?
No, because if you take a look at it, the ground station location or takeoff location will be available, and then broadcast. So law enforcement on the ground will be able to actually get that information. And I think there will be a process by which law enforcement can get that information, whether it's live, so they can do a knock and talk, or get that personally identifiable information immediately. Probably not. Unless again, there's a modification to this one, which potentially could happen in the near future, because I think there is a legitimate reason for law enforcement to be able to get that information. So, for example, they see a pattern by a certain drone that might be hanging out outside somebody's window, or that's perceived to be invading somebody's privacy. They'll eventually need to get that information either through court order or through figuring out a way to have probable cause and get that information from the feds.
That makes sense.
And then my recollection of the opinion is that if, in order for law enforcement to connect that serial number information to the personally identifying information, it needs to be pursuant to an FAA enforcement action. That there has to be something taken, and that may be a lower bar given remote ID actually being in place and in use, versus law enforcement just being able to ping a database and pull up that information on the fly.
Yep. So that's definitely on the initial side, and that's what they said they gave the okay to, or existing authority. So I think that might change in the future, but you never know.
I'm looking at the questions as we're talking, and I'm going to get off script a little bit just to answer some of these questions so we don't forget about them. Somebody says, how does remote ID apply to sub 250 gram drones? Remote ID will be required if registration is required. That's the one way that you want to remember that. So if you're flying a drone recreationally and that's under 250 gram, then you won't need to have remote ID. But if you're doing it under Part 107, then you will, because the registration is required. Somebody also, Drone Excel Haya is asking, can you guys talk about the navigable airspace and how Britain's lawsuit opened us to potential problems? We'll talk about that in a minute. That's a part of the conversation for sure. And then somebody said, will this remote ID be a prerequisite for the possible right-of-way changes under 500 feet? Do you want to talk about that, Kenji? Because that's kind of tied into the long distance, BV loss rules that may be upcoming in the future.
Yeah. So for beyond visual line of sight, remote ID is an integral and very, very important part of it. As the court noted, it's important for situational awareness, and I think there needs to be a clarification. Remote ID is not meant for detect and avoid, in essence, or collision avoidance. It's just not built that way. But it is for situational awareness. So, for example, if there's a traditional aircraft around, they could leverage remote ID to just be aware of each other as well. And if there's sensors that are put in place by third parties or whatever, they could feed that data into a system where traditional aviators could potentially access that. But it's fairly. How would I do? Scott, go ahead and take this. I need to think through this for a second.
Sure. I think one of the things that Kenji was starting to talk about is that remote ID at its core is not meant to be some sort of airspace deconfliction platform. It's not meant to say, I'm here, I am at 50 feet, and you should expect me there. Don't come that low, because there's a margin of variability essentially within the accuracy of the measurements, both on the aircraft itself and on the control station. And you're not talking about a live air traffic controller dealing with this, trying to provide strategic services to drones or other aircraft that we're sharing the airspace with, right? So there are a number of systems that are already in place to handle that. I think when you're looking at beyond visual line of sight and what we were talking about in the aviation, the ARC, that I think that remote ID will be one part of a number of mitigations and parts of the safety case that will get both the FAA and the public comfortable with drones operating in those spaces. And so that way, let's say you want to know, okay, what is that drone up there? Who is it? Or what's that purpose? You can, if you're worried about it as a operator in the general public, you can get the serial number and then submit it to law enforcement or to FAA. They can connect it to the personally identifying information. You would also be able to find a status message, sort of, is there something wrong with the drone? If you're worried about it flying erratically, you'd be able to see, okay, it's in return to home or it's lost link or something like that. That's the kind of information you'll get as a member of the general public. And then what Kenji was talking about, sort of that nefarious actors, if you're establishing a pattern, you might be able to say, all right, we've seen this drone with this specific either session ID or serial number operating in this specific space on multiple occasions. Then you can pull that data and then submit it to law enforcement or, the right people to connect it. But remote ID in and of itself is not meant to be universal, uniform traffic management. It's not meant to be air traffic control. It's meant to be an identifier. So you can say, all right, this is somebody who is hopefully operating with useful or nice intent, and they're obeying the law. And it's also meant, as what the court said, is really to keep people from being completely anonymous in their actions while they're operating a drone, so that it will hopefully keep away some of those bad actors. And then if you see a drone up there and it doesn't have remote ID, then maybe it's either somebody who falls within the exceptions or somebody who's doing something they shouldn't be doing.
Okay. So, Greg, back to Haye's original question about the right-of-way rules and the BV loss, the recommendations in the BV loss ARC. There isn't a tie-in. The tie-in is to ADSB. So, if a traditional aircraft has ADSB, then UA have to yield to it under a specific altitude. But if the aircraft do not have ADSB, then they have to yield to uncrewed aircraft at that level. So that doesn't tie in with remote ID. So as noted, since it's only for situational awareness, it's not going to give drones any special sort of privileges in terms of right of way. It's the availability of ADSB on traditional aircraft. Now, there is a concern about balloonists. There's concern lighter than air aircraft or aircraft without electrical systems. But one of the suggestions that we're making in the comments to the BVLOS ARC, which are due tomorrow, is that there might need to be FAA approving a non-TSO'd ADSB out for especially those aircraft that don't have electrical systems or can have a TSO'd ADSB out.
Yeah, there's no simple solution at the moment to any of that, and this is kind of, we're in a very young industry. If you think about how long the UAS have been really flying out there at a mass level, so everyone is still learning and trying to figure this out and trying to also accommodate an industry that is flying. ADSB is not a new technology, although it was only required a couple of years ago, but it's the technology in itself is pretty old and has a lot of limitations. Somebody was asking in the comments, can we use ADSB on drones? No, we can't, not at the moment, because the technology is not designed for that kind of volume, unfortunately. So I don't think there is an easy solution out there for trying to do this, and remote ID is a jab at it. It's not perfect for sure, but it's definitely a try. I want to get back to the case, and I want to mention something that I thought was interesting and kind of confirming what we've been saying for a while, which is the FAA rules are written in blood. But I'm going to read you the quote. It says, Brennan has not shown that any such use of remote ID have either harmed him or imminently will do so. And essentially what they're saying is there's no blood drawn at the moment, so we can't say that this is a bad rule. And I was going to try to get your take on this. I think it's pretty blunt, but sadly, it kind of shows how the government sometimes thinks.
Scott, do you want to take the first one stab at it?
Sure. I think there's a couple of ways to go about it from harm, right? Like, will this harm your access to the hobby, and your access to the national airspace system? You want to be able to go out there and fly your drone either commercially or recreationally. Essentially, remote ID is going to become a requirement if you want to access the NAS. It's not a right. It's a privilege that you're going through. You're either taking the trust test if you're the trust training if you are flying recreationally, or you're going out and getting your Part 107 if you want to operate commercially. So you understand that you're sharing the airspace with other users, and that there are risks both in the air and on the ground based on how you're flying or what you're doing. And so there are a lot of considerations that you have to take into account when you want to fly. And adding either you have to buy a drone that has remote ID built into it, or you have to retrofit, or you have to operate in an area that does not require remote ID. How much of a harm is that to someone, in this case specifically to Brennan, or he has not shown that that's going to harm him. It's going to change the way that he has to operate, or it's going to limit the ability that he has to operate. One of the things I think that you're getting at is, will there actually be physical harm to operators as a result of remote ID? That I don't think they really touched on in the case, because it wasn't a main concern of Brennan's arguments. And I know Kenji and I have both spoken about this, that we have concerns that Part 107 or recreational operators, you're using specialized equipment. In some cases, it's very expensive, and you might be doing something that someone feels is beyond their, you are invading their rights or invading their privacy, whether they're correct or not in operating your drone. Whether you're flying commercially and you're taking pictures of a piece of property or videoing an event or something like that, somebody may have an issue with that. And if they can locate you as an operator via the control station location, we're probably going to have some issues. And, I personally, I've run into that as an operator. I for 5 years ran my own drone business prior to joining AUVSI, where I was out there, taking videos and flying and doing things like that. I would be lying if I didn't tell you I haven't had a shotgun pointed in my direction when I've been operating. And, I think that we don't want to see anything like that happen. We do not want to see blood as a result of this. And, it's something that we're going to have to tackle as an industry and as a country.
So from my perspective, what this means is the issue just isn't ripe, which means and if you look at the analysis, they talk about this in terms of the issue hasn't, or the key facts haven't crystallized, which means there hasn't been any Fourth Amendment constitutional violation as of yet. So since remote ID isn't even active, haven't been any circumstances where remote ID has been used in a way that violates the constitutional right of the Fourth Amendment. But on page 24, they say, we do not foreclose the possibility of declaratory judgment or injunctive action by a party establishing the application of the remote ID rule to its own specifically delineated drone use would subject it to an unconstitutional privacy deprivation, which means, again, if there's specific injury that happens in the future, then absolutely the court will step in and take that analysis of that potential violation and perhaps make a ruling in that specific circumstance, not invalidating the rule, but in case the remote ID is used in such a fashion where there's a violation.
Yeah, they want to take it case by case, essentially.
Exactly.
And I think that's where the courts went a little bit during oral arguments, and that's where we weren't sure what was going to happen when the opinion came around, was if they're sitting there going through all of these hypotheticals in areas or situations where rights might be limited or might be violated under the Fourth Amendment. But essentially what the court said in this argument is none of those situations have shown here, or not enough to say the rule on its face should be invalid and should be vacated.
Yeah. They're basically saying you got to prove that all of it is bad, not just a portion of it, for us to get rid of it, which somewhat makes sense if you think about it. Now, there was another bit in here, and we'll finish this on the Fourth Amendment section. We'll move on to the next thing, which is it said that requiring to identify a person's location during a short flight, you mentioned that, Kenji, a little bit, says very little about anything else in their life. It doesn't talk about their politics. It doesn't have any personal information available. It doesn't say if you're religious or not, or even your gender or any of that. So they're basically saying it doesn't even say that you're home or not. It just basically shows your location. So that was kind of their counter argument, which I thought was interesting, because we don't hear that conversation very often, at least in our industry. And I think that's kind of a good counterpoint in a way.
And the other piece too is when you're broadcasting, if you're broadcasting in a very rural area, guess what? Without any receivers around, if there's nobody listening, and then there's no issue, right?
Yeah.
There during oral argument, there's this person saying, "Hey, if you're on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, do you still have to broadcast?" Yeah, absolutely you do. But if nobody's picking up on it, it's like, who cares? There's no issue.
Yep.
But if you're in the middle of a major city that might be near an airport, yeah, then there's big concerns there, and people will likely have receivers around. So there you go, and you're in the air where it's visible to all.
And then no expectation of privacy. All right. Well, I think we've talked quite a bit about this Fourth Amendment case, which I think was probably the biggest portion of the document, and then the explanation from the court as well. The next section was Brennan that argued that there were some secret communication during an FBI Academy demo on the remote ID capabilities. The court essentially said that they were demonstrating network remote ID, which was eventually nixed from the final rule. So there was really no interference about this. Can you maybe tell us about why is this an important point that they made in here in terms of the process, maybe?
Kenji, you want to start?
So absolutely. So one of the things during the rulemaking process, there's a ban on ex parte communications, which are non-public sort of communications with the parties that are interested, especially the rulemaking authority. And Brennan really said, "Hey, there's these secret meetings going on. There's conversations going on behind the sort of behind the curtain, which should be public and open and available to everybody." And that consisted of really some of the testing around the network portion, or the network remote ID. And as Greg, you noted, there was communication, but the court said there is no explicit bar on ex parte communications, as long as they didn't materially influence the action taken by the FAA. And in this case, as we know, network remote ID was jettisoned from the final rule. So in essence, they're saying there was no harm at all, since what they were complaining about was thrown out. And even then, which means there was actually no influence on the final product at all. So there was no violation on its face. But the court even said, even if, as long as it didn't have a material impact, then it's not a big deal.
Yep. Scott, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Kenji did a great job of explaining it. Essentially you had companies in the industry trying to figure out, okay, what is a way that we could demonstrate it where it would make sense or it doesn't. And it ended up being a piece that they completely removed between the NPRM and the final rule. So there wasn't any harm.
Yep. The next piece that was in there, that was number 3 on my list, is that Brennan claimed twice that the final ruling was not a logical outgrowth of the proposed rule. Now, the first one, I'm trying to wrap my head around it, because I think it's grasping at straws, and no disrespect to anyone out there that worked on this case, but he claimed that they changed the requirement for barometric altitude to geometric altitude using a GPS instead of using a barometer inside of the aircraft. He said that the FAA should have given a chance to comment on this. The court kind of came back and said a lot of people made a comment that geometric altitude would actually be a lot easier to install and propagate, and that this was a better solution. And they kind of threw this pretty quickly. What am I missing here on this, Scott? Do you want to? Did you read the same way that I did?
Yeah, I did, and I think it's it's one of those things where we talk about this in the drone industry all the time, that we want rules that are performance based versus prescriptive. And, I think people may had in their mind that, oh, this was going to be the way that we were going to be able to comply with the rule. And the FAA said, you know what, actually, this is probably the better way to do it. And they're not saying specifically like, oh, you must have this specific GPS chip, or it must be placed in this area, or it must, meet this maximum requirement, right? It's just they felt that that was going to be a better way in order to hit at the overall drive behind remote ID, which was to provide the location of the operator and of the aircraft. And they said, this is probably going to be a better way for us to do it, both from a price perspective and from an integration perspective. So I see where the court's coming from. And it to me, those are your main options when it comes to how could we equip the technology to be able to meet remote ID. Barometric or GPS are kind of your two main options.
Yep. Kenji?
And from my perspective, what's really interesting is the court goes into a little bit of detail saying, you know what, the FAA was responsive to the public comment, and that they took into consideration what people said and commented and said, hey, this might be a better idea. Or, for example, that whether modules were viable, and the FAA took that seriously. And you actually see that in the final rule itself, from the NPRM to the final rule, that they've been responsive every single step of the way to comments. And I think that's what's important here overall, is that the FAA has been very sort of forward looking, and they changed quite significantly from what they had, and they invited comment on modules. They had comments on GPS. So I'd say that the final rule is definitely a natural outgrowth of the NPRM in a good way.
Yeah, I was actually surprised when the final ruling came out, and I started reading through, and I was like, whoa, they actually listened to most of the comments that were made, and the feeling in the industry. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting angle that they decided to take. But again, I wasn't on the team. So
and you have to remember, when it comes to the comments that were given, the FAA received over 53,000 comments from the public between the NPRM and the final rule. The final rule itself made a very big point of pulling from specific comments to talk about either why they agreed with the comment, or why they agreed with the suggestion, or why they didn't. And I think the court also did that as well. They pulled from specific, pieces of phrasings from the final rule in their decision that they cited. They said, look, here's where the FAA considered this option, and this is why we believe that your argument is invalid based on that action by the FAA.
Yep. I see people in the comment not liking the fact that I just said that the FAA listened to comment. The FAA did listen to comment. Maybe they didn't listen to your comment, but they did make a major change on what they had proposed. And if they hadn't, then yeah, we would have a shit show of remote ID, even worse than it is now, quite frankly. But they did listen to some of it. Yes, they could have done a better job, but there's been some changes in here. Anyways, the next thing was number 4, which is the FAA did not consult with the president of the RTCA, which is the Radio Technical Commission for Aeronautics, and then also the director of the NIST, as required by Congress. There was a quick brief on this. The FAA basically did, apparently, as per the court. Did you guys know more about this, and what this interaction was about?
Yeah, it's a procedural challenge.
Right. Yeah.
And Kenji can speak to it more because he was involved with the remote ID and tracking arc, where I think the court's pointed saying, look, we worked with RTCA, we worked with NIST.
Yeah. And that's pretty much it, Scott. They were involved, but they don't have to participate in every single aspect. Well, I'll read it. But Congress did not require that RTCA or NIST weigh in on every facet of the proposed rule. They were involved in the ARC. Yep. So the court's like, where's the beef, in essence?
Yeah, because essentially the ARC fed into the NPRM, which fed into the final rule, and RTCA and NIST were involved in that sort of foundational piece of the whole process.
Yep. Number 5, I think, was this is the big piece that Haya was asking about earlier, which is navigable airspace section. Basically, Brennan said that the FAA overlooked some important comments, one of them being on the FAA not having the statutory authority to regulate the airspace other than navigable airspace. Now, this is a battle that has been going on for ages now with trying to get the FAA to define navigable airspace. The response from the court was pretty brief in a sense on this. They basically quoted 49 USC 4103, which is a section that talks about the FAA's authority with the airspace, that they have control of the navigable airspace. They also quoted a section of what navigable airspace was defined as, which I thought was interesting. And that was in here. I'll read it to you. The navigable airspace includes airspace above minimum flight altitude, which to me I put in bold letters in my notes, and the airspace necessary for safe takeoff and landing of aircraft. So they somewhat brushed this off and said we have control of the airspace. Well, the FAA has control of the airspace, and that's the end of the discussion. Can you talk about this some more? Maybe Kenji, get started. I know you had some pretty good opinions on that.
Oh yeah, I have some very strong opinions on this. The court, in essence, saying that navigable airspace extends to the ground, and I think that's excuse me. Hold on, Scott, go ahead.
Sure. I think when you look at the laws themselves and when they were enacted, I think you're talking about performance characteristics for traditional aircraft that are different than those of a drone. And if a drone is considered an aircraft, our minimum safe operating altitudes are pretty much from the ground on up. And I think that's where we have a hang up is, well, that this law that was written and enacted, decades ago, how can it be interpreted in order to give the FAA that power, right? And I think that it's the way that we operate, right? Drones are able to safely operate at low level altitude, whether you're talking about 500 feet because you're around a structure and it's a 400 foot tall structure and you're up 100 feet. You just have to understand the concept of what the NAS is. And it's a shared public resource that we are all accessing, hopefully in a safe manner with drones and with other traditional aircraft. And it's a question of, is there a delineation or a division if you're flying, say, near a house or under the treetops? And, the whole idea was that if you're below trees or below obstacles so low that you wouldn't be considered in the airspace. But I think the courts essentially said you are. And, this is one of the things that we are involved in on a regular basis at the state and local level and at the federal level. It would be great for us to have a stronger statement from the federal government, not just, whether that's Congress or the FAA, someone talking about the importance of having essentially a unified regulation of operations in the NAS. There are definitely items that fall to state and local that are important for them to have a voice in and for them to have a piece of how they regulate those operations that are connected to the ground, whether that's privacy, noise, things of that nature, versus safety of the national airspace system being equitable with its use. And hopefully Kenji's had a little bit of a chance to get something to drink, and he can add on to that.
I didn't have a chance to have something to drink, but I think I cleared that frog out of my throat. So my apologies on that. I think what's important also is it's that exclusive sovereignty. As Scott notes, it's the main issue is that we don't want a patchwork of regulations of low level airspace, because, for example, if there's different remote ID rules throughout the United States, there's different equipage rules throughout the United States, we're gonna run into a problem. For example, if I start flying in another state, I might be subject to different rules for equipage on drones. So it's that would have been a very, very negative thing. You also have entities that are trying to, in essence, limit where drones fly to corridors over streets and stuff, which is absolutely inefficient and also creates even more hazards, especially if you have a bunch of drones just flying over the street. There's the higher chances of collision as well. So that's one of the issues that we've been having. But I think being able to leverage this language saying the U.S. government has exclusive sovereignty is great. And that was one of the big wins for the industry. It is dicta, which means it's not, they didn't rule on it, but it's persuasive in any argument that we make before the courts, or before we can also bring this to state legislatures and say, look, you're preempted on the airspace and the management of the airspace. And and if you think about it, it makes sense too, because as soon as you take off that drone into the airspace, it can go flying up, it can go really high. So the FAA needs to be able to manage that risk. And if you can't manage that risk, then that creates a danger to both traditional aviation and also other folks too, because say, for example, the drone takes off, it creates a problem. The other piece too is they say the navigable airspace in the United States includes airspace above minimum flight altitudes, but doesn't say only above minimum safe altitudes as well. So take that into consideration. And when you look at 91.119, it also says anywhere an altitude allowing, if power unit fails, an emergency landing without undue hazard to persons or property on the surface. You think about drones, they're very lightweight. It's like 250 grams. You can fly it over people. If it drops, it's not going to harm anybody. It doesn't cause an undue hazard. So there's a lot of different parts to this, but I think what's most important is that the FAA has that exclusive jurisdiction over the airspace.
Yeah, and somebody in the comments made a point that some states have preemption laws that would prevent local municipalities from creating rules. I think there are 17 of them at the moment, actually Arizona being one of them. Is that a protection that would help if state laws decided to, or states decided to start doing things about drones?
Absolutely. That's super helpful. Go ahead, Scott. I took the last one.
Oh, no, you're good. It's something that we definitely find helpful just because it gives you a single organization to go towards. It reduces confusion both for municipalities and for operators. So if you're going to one organization where then they can also communicate very closely with FAA or other federal elements that have the essentially the power to regulate, I think that you're not then left with that patchwork at an even smaller level. So if recreational operators and commercial operators are worried about complying with one federal level remote ID law, think about if you had that from city to city, township to township, state to state, and you want to travel and fly, not even commercially, recreationally, would you need a new dongle? Would you need different rules? Are the requirements of the messaging that gets pushed out? Or could you essentially have a state that says, you know what, we don't agree with the FAA. We think you need network remote ID. You need to be connected at all times. And, I think that that's what a lot of people don't realize is that if this case had gone a different way and the court had invalidated the rule on its face, we likely would have then had a lot of other things that would have happened in its wake.
Yep. And I mean, if you think remote ID is bad, wait until every single state that can do their own thing, and then every single municipality can do their own thing. And this will truly be the end of the hobby, because you'll never be able to fly anywhere because your neighbor is going to say, no, you can't fly over here because I have control over up to 200 feet. You got to think about some of these things. I think this was a big oversight in the lawsuit and the possible consequences that could have happened if they had prevailed on this. That could have been pretty bad for the rest of us. So another comment here that I wanted to bring up, because I thought the response from the court here was a little bit lightweight, but Brennan said that the FAA flat out did not respond to the AMA's comment that model aircraft should be exempted from the rules. The court basically says, well, the FAA acknowledged the suggestion, doesn't mean that we agreed with it. And then they basically said home built will be exempt from design and production requirement, but not operational requirement. So they're basically saying, well, we gave you a little bit, but you're still not going to be able to not fly without remote ID. Can you guys talk about this portion?
To me, it's a logical outgrowth of how the FAA has turned to regulating recreational drones and versus commercial drones. Think about it. You had that where originally recreational aircraft weren't covered by Part 107, and now they are. I think the idea is that the way the FAA has talked about is they want the airspace to be safe. And if you want to operate in it, this is essentially the minimum stakes that it's going to be required if you want to fly. They're not saying you can't fly. They're not saying that you can't build your recreational aircraft. And it's just, if you want to operate it in the NAS, you need to have remote ID. And
Yep.
I'm sure that the courts could have gone a little bit more in depth, or that the FAA could have gone more in depth in their commentary, but it's not a requirement.
Yep. Somebody asked in the comment if there is any talk about grandfathering all drones and just require new drones to be manufactured. Unfortunately, no, but there is an option to upgrade, which is going to be putting a module on top of it. I want to talk about the last piece. This was on the very last page of the document, and we'll open it up for more questions with the 10 minutes we have left. But Brennan, as a lot of us have been making the same comment, mentioned that there is potential harm and theft of equipment to drone pilots that can be happening because the location is shared. Again, I thought the court response was interesting. They said Brennan's dissatisfaction with the substance of the response, aka relying on the operator's precaution and then basically using law enforcement when needed to address such attack, is no reason to invalidate the rule. They basically said, well, you have access to law enforcement. There are rules out there, so you're not going to get attacked. I thought that was a little bit lightweight. They did the same thing in the final ruling when they responded to all these comments and basically said, well, we're going to keep going because you'll have access to law enforcement if there is any issues. I don't think that solves it. I don't know what the solution is to this problem. I think, Kenji, you had a solution we discussed on Pixel a while back. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure, absolutely. It seems like the FAA and DOJ really aren't taking the action, and DOJ won't take it. Has I won't say stated, but implied that unless there's any blood drawn, there won't be any federal prosecutions. Although Vic and I are trying to change that and bend the curve. And one of the interesting things was at the last Advanced Aviation Advisory Committee meeting, Vic brought that up, and we garnered a lot of interest, especially from the drone delivery folks who realized that there's issues with shootings and all. So you'll see some coming out of there, but there is a potential solution that might come from private industry. And private industry, I mean, as some folks know, I have a patent on remote ID. One of the interesting components of it is I'm thinking what I'd like to do is if anybody wants to create an app, they'll need to license that patent. And as a term of that license, that they cannot provide the takeoff location or the ground station location to the general public. And I think that's very important. And I think a lot of first responders and a lot of law enforcement I've talked to said, but that's totally okay. And then only providing that takeoff and ground station location to law enforcement or public safety. And a lot of pilots have come out and said, hey, that's okay. I expect that, because the fear is that the general public, once they have that information, will start using it to harass or even assault pilots on the ground. So the idea is to leverage private industry to ensure that your data as a pilot is protected, so you don't have the, excuse my pejorative, but the Karens of the world don't get a hold of it and give you problems.
Yep. Yep. Some people are asking questions about your remote ID solution, Kenji, but I want people to understand that you have a patent. You don't have an actual module or final solution. This will be done by industry partners that are going to work with you and your patent to do that, right?
Correct. And I do have a remote ID app in development as well.
And people are asking, how much would it weigh? Do you have any insights as to how much a module would weigh? I've seen some online for the European version that are about 7 grams that would be all fully integrated into the drone in itself. So have you seen anything else?
Yeah, they're very lightweight. In essence, hold on. Let me see if I can find one. Here's one. It's a little bit heavier. That's by Envoli, which is a Swiss company. It's a little bit heavier. I'd say this is probably like 100 grams. But the reason why this is so heavy is because it has 4G LTE built in as well. I do have one that I can run and grab it if Scott's talking. That is very lightweight. I'd say 10 grams or so. That can plug into a Pixhawk. So I'll be back.
I've seen iterations that are probably about the size of think a Spectrum radio, so like postage stamp, not something huge, especially if you're tying into aircraft power or, there's not something like a cellular modem in it. it's literally like a Bluetooth radio or a Wi-Fi radio. And the other thing that we haven't really talked about is if we get to a means of compliance that makes sense, where you could utilize the onboard existing equipment, if there's a modification to the firmware that would allow the existing onboard equipment to send the signal at the same time as what you're getting for your command and control, you may be able to send remote ID information over that, or newer drones, think about it, standard remote ID. So something that's gone through the whole process from the ground up may be able to integrate something like that versus these lighter weight sensors or radios versus, something that has like other equipment in it, like a rechargeable battery or something like that. I think if you can essentially vamp off of existing power on the drone itself, then you reduce a lot of the weight requirements that you would have out of a module.
So people can expect to have maybe buying a flight controller that would have a remote ID module integrated into it with a small GPS chip. Now, I see some people in the comments also asking, this is not going to fit in my tiny Whoop, or this is not going to fit in my micro drone. But remember that if you're flying for recreational purposes, this is not something that you need. If you're flying sub 250 gram drones, then you won't need to have this technology on board. So you should be fine at that level. Now, if you're flying micro drones for commercial purposes, which I don't know if many people are doing this, then yes, you would technically need to have it. But otherwise, you can expect to have a somewhat small solution. Kenji, you came back. Did you have more data on? There you go.
This one is 1/8 of an ounce, and it can plug in directly into a Mavlink to Pixhawk or something like that, or any other board like that.
And this has a GPS unit integrated into it that would basically do all the work. So you wouldn't need to have a full GPS drone in order to use this.
This one, it ties into the. I'm actually going to attach it to me through my 3DR Solo, and that this will. I'll have to check whether it has GPS, but I think it might get GPS off of the drone itself.
Yeah, but it's something like that either plugs in on a pin out or a CAN or something like that, where you have, especially if it's a home built drone and you have access to the board and the components where you could integrate something yourself. I think that's a much more workable solution.
Yeah, and that's 1/8 of an ounce. And I think what's happening is the Bluetooth chips and Wi-Fi chips are pretty dang small. So if you look at, for example, the TBS Nano, it's probably going to be about that size. You'll find components or modules that'll be that size coming out as well. So I'm not too concerned.
Yeah, I think the example I used was a Spectrum radio wire gone. So just give people an idea of kind of what size they should probably expect. And I think it just comes down to what do the final requirements of an approved means of compliance come down to. And so what technical items would you need to have on board to meet that?
Yep. And by the way, talk about MLCs that got kicked back from the FAA to ASTM. So we are waiting on a couple things. I guess there were some issues. I don't know the exact issues at this point, but we can definitely give you an update as we find out more. And like we discussed on the Pixel Show, that is a problem because a lot of manufacturers have to start building, especially and there's issues if there's no MOC. What do they build to, right? So
45 days to go.
Yep.
45 days to go. It's going to be interesting.
We have ongoing discussions about that to try and make sure either we can get it across the line or that there's some sort of accommodations made to make it work. But I think the upshot of all of this is the sky is not falling. You're still going to be able to operate your drone. There are going to be places that if you want to fly without remote ID, you still can. It shouldn't be this overly burdensome thing that you can't either retrofit to your existing drone or buy in a new drone. And the idea is that by equipping with remote ID and having a large adoption of this, that we're going to have safer airspace, and that you might, in the long run, be enabled to do other things like operate a remote ID enabled drone over people or over roads and things of that nature. So there's really commercial applications that having a robust remote ID framework will be enabled by, and that it shouldn't really give you that much heartburn as a recreational operator otherwise.
Yep, and I want to clarify that the requirement for remote ID is is for users like those that are listening is not until a year from September. So we get another year and 45 days before this becomes a requirement. Now, I do see comments also about the price of some of these on the website that you have shown, Kenji. Yes, they might be expensive at the moment, and I think this price needs to come down. But remember, again, we're about a year before this has to be put into any kind of drone. So mass production, I'm sure, is going to bring the cost down. I would have a note to manufacturers of remote ID components. If you want to sell them, make them priced at the right level, because otherwise it's going to be massive compliance. I know a lot of industries or a lot of groups are already talking about non-compliance, but if we make a module $160, then it's not going to work for the majority. So I think manufacturers have to be realistic at that level.
Yeah.
Yep.
It'll
be interesting.
The other note that I want to make is when people think about broadcast remote ID, remember it was specifically designed to limit the broadcast radius, because the higher up you are in the air, the wider area you'll broadcast to, because all radio line of sight. But as you decrease that height, that radio line of sight is going to decrease. So as you get lower and lower ground, the area that you'll be broadcasting to is going to be a little bit smaller. So that was on purpose, by the way. But I think this ruling, what was most important about it is it gives clarity to the industry in terms of it's not going to be thrown out. We can start moving forward with a lot of the rules and the compliance and all those things, because when it was filed, there was a lot of concern. We didn't know where things are going, but with this, at least we have some structure, because clarity, either bad or good, is better for the industry, because then we can start designing toward it.
Yep. I agree. Well, we're getting onto an hour of show now. If you have any last questions, please leave them in the comments. I see people are asking, will there be modules available by this time, by the time Remote ID goes into effect? Yes, I'm sure we will be good by then. I wouldn't worry too much about that part. If you have a DJI drone, you probably will be fine. If you have a drone from any large manufacturer, you probably will be fine when the time all this comes around, as long as they're pretty recent. And then there's a question about enforcement, which is a good question. How will this be enforced? I'm going to tell people the FAA is not going to have time to go and enforce every single flight that people do, but the day that something happens, that's when the enforcement will happen. So it's always the same thing. You know, they don't check everybody's Part 107 certificate when you go fly, but eventually it's always coming down when liability hits the fan and then something happens. So don't know if any of you want to add anything to that.
And if that person that flies at 5,000 feet over Manhattan, remote ID is going to be a problem for you. If FDNY let me know, there's a specific person who's flying a drone at that height all the time. So it's trying to track down folks like that. So if you'll only get looked into if you do something bad consistently, and or something bad happens, somebody's injured. So it's a matter of degree. If you think about it, they're not going to go after somebody who's off in the middle of nowhere. There's not much, but if something bad happens, that's when you got to worry.
I know people like to pick on the FAA, and so do we from time to time. But from all my interactions with them, they have very little interest in being the police of millions of people that are flying drones out there. They really care about those that are doing stupid stuff that's going to endanger the life of others on the ground. And quite frankly, they don't have time to go check if you have your Part 107 certificate or if you're flying, beyond line of sight by being 405 feet instead of being 400 feet. That's not the purpose of the FAA. And I know people are going to probably hate me for saying this, but that's really the reality. When you start talking to inspectors, that's not how they operate. So, all right. Well, I think that might be closing words right here. I think we had a great show. I really want to thank you guys for spending the time and going over this document. I think this we're going to be talking about this document. It's going to be referred to in the future for many, many cases that are going to be brought in front of the FAA and in front of courts. So sometimes in a good way and maybe sometimes not in such a good way, but we'll find out in the future. So Kenji, Scott, thanks for your time, and we will see you on the next discussion.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate it.
For coming in. Thanks for leaving your comments. We always appreciate it. We don't always have to agree, but sometimes we have a good educated discussion is the best way to get some of these things out and make sure we educate people. So that's it. See you guys later.